Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard.
Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today we have Allison Durek of the Eugene Debs Foundation, and she's going to tell us about the things she does and what sounds to me like a fascinating job. So welcome, Allison.
Great. I'm so sorry, but I lost a little bit of what you were saying there. I don't know if it's my connection or yours.
I was introducing you to our listeners and telling us about how we're excited to hear what you're going to tell us.
I'm so excited to be here and share about Eugene Debs.
Excellent. So if you can kindly tell us about yourself, a brief biographical sketch, and specifically what led you to become executive director of the Eugene Debs Foundation.
Sure. So first of all, a little bit further back about my background. I was raised in rural northern Indiana in a union family, union educators, manufacturing workers, and I eventually went to Indiana State University. I wanted to be a music teacher. Coming from a long line of educators and musicians, I was really excited to start teaching music. And I also learned around this time that it's really difficult to be an educator in a state like Indiana right now, as resources get funneled away and teachers become scapegoats for problems faced by schools. But that kind of started to open up my mind a little bit about these bigger systemic problems and how we might start to fix them. And long story short here, changed my major to political science. I got into a history research assistantship with a member of the history faculty at Indiana State. She was an officer with the Debs Foundation. Her name was Lisa Phillips. She's been a great mentor to me. And as part of her assistantship, offered to put me in the house one night a week, the Debs house, to give tours while they were between permanent staff. And I loved it so much, showing people the home of Eugene Debs and connecting his life and work to our times, big social changes, that I applied for the permanent director position, and they went ahead and hired me. So I've been working with the Debs Foundation since I graduated for about 5 years now. The vast majority of my work is giving tours at the Debs house, but it's also a lot of the behind the scenes work as well of, running a small house museum. But that's a little bit about how I came into this work. I also was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, the union that Debs founded around the time that I started working at the house. So I was super excited about labor organizing, labor issues, and student organizing. So kind of bringing that activist mentality to our work at the Debs Museum was really exciting.
Excellent. So kindly tell us who Eugene Debs is. Most people have probably heard of him, especially our audience. But kindly tell us how you view him, what makes him such an important figure.
Absolutely. And there's so much. Debs lived a long life and did a lot of different things with his time and his life. But he was born and raised in Terre Haute, Indiana, called that town his home his entire life. Grew up and eventually joined the labor movement with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen when he was 19 years old. Worked his way through that union to become a national officer, and that is where we really get into Debs, the labor leader, kind of the first pillar of his legacy. We at the museum recognize 4 key pillars of Debs's life work. So there's Debs, the labor leader, and the socialist. Those are the 2 pillars that most folks who have heard the name Debs will maybe have some association with. The 2 other pillars are Debs, the anti-war advocate or the peace advocate, and then Debs, the prison abolitionist. And let me get to that soon. But as a labor leader, Debs came to see how our political system was really set up, in his view, in a way that favored the wealthiest, the owning class, the capitalists. And he really saw both Democrats and Republicans as working for the interests of the ruling class rather than the working class. So after being defeated in the Pullman strike of 1894, Debs did not immediately convert to socialism, but he started to open up his mind for new ways that we could organize our economy and our political system, and eventually landed on socialism as what he saw as the most appropriate way to think about transforming our whole system. So he co-founded the Socialist Party of America, ran for president 5 times as a socialist candidate from 1900 to 1920. Now, the last time Debs ran for president, 1920, was from his prison cell because Debs had spoken out against U.S. involvement in the First World War. And under the Wilson administration, anti-war speech was a crime. Debs got a 10-year prison sentence and ran for president from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, earning nearly 1 million votes for the Socialist Party ticket. So that's our third pillar of Debs, the peace advocate. And then finally, Debs the prison abolitionist. One of the only books Debs ever wrote was called Walls and Bars, and that was a collection of essays about his experiences being incarcerated, first after the Pullman strike of 1894, and then around 1920 for opposing war. Anyway, he wrote about his experiences and then connected them to these greater issues of capitalism and how socialists proposed to not just reform, but do away with prisons as we know them by addressing the root causes of crime, which Debs would say is our capitalist economy, our capitalist system. So that's Debs in a nutshell for you. The labor organizer, the labor leader, Debs the socialist, the peace advocate, and the prison abolitionist. Long answer to a short question.
Great. So kindly tell us how Debs defines socialism, because a lot of people have different definitions of what socialism is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for Debs, socialism was at its core about the idea of democracy. I hear recently and every now and then about this idea that that capitalism and democracy are supposed to be counterparts because the people choose. And I honestly found myself feeling a little bit frustrated with that because I think by that logic, it's people with money who choose. Now, back to Debs and socialism. He would sum it up as the earth for the people, or democratic worker control of industry. And for different socialists, that takes different forms, maybe through worker-owned cooperatives. But for Debs, it was more about public ownership. So Debs was running on a radical restructuring of our economy to worker control, and then using democratic government or public ownership as the mechanism to achieve that worker control. So if that helps, he's also campaigning on ideas like the weekend, child labor laws, worker compensation, kind of a laundry list of labor reforms that I could rattle on and about that many workers have achieved today, but these were just part of the picture for Debs. At the end of the day, he wants to restructure the economy to worker control, and then also radically expand our idea of our democracy politically speaking. So Debs and the Socialist Party platform included things like abolishing the Senate because it wasn't directly elected for most of his life. He also wanted proportional representation, which is a big topic for us third-party folks. He wanted universal suffrage in law as well as in fact. And expanded use of referendum, recall, and initiative. So getting more direct participation in government, because really, if we sum it up for socialism, if we don't want, for example, the railroads to control the people, then for socialists, the solution is for the people to own the railroads. And if the mechanism to do that is government or public ownership, then we got to make sure that the people actually control the government instead of a tiny class of the wealthiest. So I hope that sums up socialism in broad strokes for you, but that's also how Debs understood it.
Sure.
Great.
Since Debs lived in Terre Haute, Indiana, and that's where the museum with his home is, can you explain to our audience what the city is like both then and now?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to go ahead and say Terre Haute. We use a quasi-French pronunciation of it over here, but when Debs was born in Terre Haute, it was a town of about 5,000 people, and he witnessed dramatic change in the town over the course of his life. At a certain point, the town would start to double its population every decade until it started to float around 50,000 around 1920 when Debs, or about 60,000 when Debs returned from prison to Terre Haute after his sentence was commuted. So this was a transportation hub. We're located on the Wabash River, later the Wabash and Erie Canal, which would soon become irrelevant, but we're also stuck right on the National Road, or US 40 today, one of the first federally funded highways, and also a railroad hub as well. So during Debs' lifetime, he saw his town become a hub of transportation and industry. Today, Terre Haute is deindustrialized, like much of this part of the Midwest. We're predominantly white. We have the designation as a bellwether county because Vigo County, where Terre Haute is located, tends to predict the outcome of the presidential election, dating back decades with just a couple of exceptions, including 2020. We broke our streak that year, last year. But anyway, we're not as representative as the rest of the country, but we do have elements of a college town. We've got three major colleges, universities, actually four in Terre Haute and around Terre Haute. We have rural areas, farmland around the city. And I think hopefully that's getting a little bit into what Debs would have described, or what we're talking about with Terre Haute then and now. Another defining feature of Terre Haute is its poverty rate and people who are asset limited, income constrained, or what the United Way designates as an ALICE, ALICE group. So these are folks who are basically the working poor, living paycheck to paycheck and not able to meet basic expenses. I can't tell you the exact percentage of people in Terre Haute who fall into this category, but it's pretty staggering. One of the higher rates in the state of Indiana. And I think a lot of that has to do with our deindustrialization, which some folks will connect to Terre Haute's labor history. I don't think that's entirely fair, but some will draw the connection that, oh, Terre Haute's been deindustrialized because of its connection or associations with a violent labor past. And that's, I would say, not really accurate. It more has to do with prioritizing profit by outsourcing, as we see around the rest of the country. So that's a little bit about Debs and Terre Haute today, too.
Excellent. So since the home is where the museum is, can you explain what the home is like to our audience on this audio podcast? And also, if in any way the house is reflects upon who Eugene Debs is as a person.
Oh, yeah, for sure. This is my favorite topic, is chatting about the house. And today, the Debs Museum is on the campus of Indiana State University, but at the time that Gene and Kate had it built in 1890, it was several blocks away from what was the normal school that would eventually become ISU. So at the time that the house was built, 1890, that part of Terre Haute was a pretty fashionable residential area, about halfway between downtown and the railroad, the train station's a few blocks north of the house. So it's a nice proximity to business happening downtown, and then frequent travels that the Debses would engage in, getting to the train station, which is their primary mode of getting around. But anyway, Gene and Kate lived in that house on 8th Street for the remainder of their lives. It was and is a lovely Victorian or Queen Anne style home, 2.5 stories above ground plus a full basement. The first floor has largely been restored to look a lot like an 1890 Victorian home, with a good amount of original furnishings and family items in the house as well. But after Gene and Kate's death, Gene died in 1926. Kate would die 10 years later, 1936. Then the house became a family home to a history instructor at what's now ISU. Fun little side note, since we're on the third parties topic here, but that professor's son went on to be a major scholar of the history of the Socialist Party. So that father and son were John and David Shannon. Anyway, by about 1950, that family moved on and Theta Chi fraternity moved in. So the Debs house was a frat house for about a decade through the 50s, and I can't begin to guess how, preservation minded the guys were, but the house is still standing at least, so we're going to give them some credit there. And then in the early 60s, it actually got a little more nerve-wracking because a developer bought the house and cut it up into apartments to rent out to students from college towns. So that meant changing the floor plan, painting the woodwork, walling off a lot of the original features like the pocket doors. And it's also around that time that ISU is expanding, buying up all the old Victorian homes that used to line 8th Street, making up Gene and Kate's neighborhood, and eventually flattening those to make room for the campus that we know and love today. So it was at this time that historians and other academics at ISU, plus people involved in the labor movement locally and nationally, recognized the threat to this historic structure and came together to form the Eugene V. Debs Foundation for the sake of preserving the home as a memorial to Eugene Debs. So the foundation started recruiting its charter members who all put in sizable donations to purchase the home. We ended up purchasing the house in 1962, doing a lot of work on the home, opening the museum to the public in 1965, and our designation as a National Historic Landmark came in 1966, very early on in that program. Now it stood as a house museum for longer than it was actually the Debs residence. So it's a fun little fun fact about the house. But when guests come in, they are treated to tours of up to 2 hours, but usually closer to 1 hour, depending on the visitor's interest, of the 3 above ground stories of the house. The first floor I mentioned has a lot of period furniture and items that belong to the Debs family. The second floor are bedrooms with very few original furnishings, but I'm currently working on, with some volunteers, the new exhibits, one for each pillar of the legacy in each of the 4 bedrooms on the second floor. So there's exciting things coming to the Debs house. And then the attic of the house is actually my favorite part of the museum. It's a big open space full of gorgeous murals by the artist John Laska, who we can talk about in more depth if you like. But the murals take a chronological journey around the attic through Debs's life, starting with his boyhood, his childhood in Terre Haute, French immigrant parents, and his upbringing on writers like Victor Hugo and Voltaire, all the way to him working as a railroader, as a locomotive fireman, joining the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, running for office as a Democrat, getting thwarted, as you could imagine, and then co-founding the American Railway Union, leading the Pullman strike, and then his foray into socialism. The murals are really gorgeous, and there's actually a virtual tour available of the murals on our Facebook page, or anybody can set up a Zoom tour if they'd like to see those with me sometime. So that's a little bit about the museum. Still run by our parent organization, the Debs Foundation, and we remain open for tours totally free. And actually, I'd like to give a quick pitch here, or an invite, if anybody would like to take a tour of the museum. We're open by appointment right now as we work on some upgrades and improvements on our building, but we do offer tours totally free. Suggested donation is $5 per person, but we don't shake anybody down for that. Tours are available by appointment, for in-person, or on Zoom. So if you don't want to come all the way to Terre Haute, please head over to our website and figure out how to get a hold of us. You can also just email us, museum@debsfoundation.org, and I can take you on a Zoom tour of the entire house or welcome you in person.
So the Zoom tour, you say you can take them on a Zoom tour. Are you doing the vocal delivery while they're looking at the information on Zoom?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is, and it's kind of low tech, but it gets the job done. I just use Zoom on a cell phone and take us through one room at a time with my headset, and that way you're able to see on the phone's camera, but also hear the guided docent version of the tour. And we're able to interact, have a nice back and forth Q&A conversations as we go through. So it was totally personalized and live if you'd like to take the virtual tour.
Sure. You mentioned that John Laska. He's not someone I personally have heard of. So can you explain more about him?
Yeah, absolutely. John Laska is was a real pillar of the arts community in Terre Haute. He was born in New York, a child of Polish immigrants. He was drafted into World War II and then came back to study on the GI Bill at art schools in New York and Chicago. Eventually taught art education at ISU, across the street from the Debs house, and and then art elementary art in our local public schools. I'm stumbling over myself today, but Laska considered himself part of this Debsian tradition and considered the murals his crowning achievement, a labor of love. And he also has visual art, sculptures, paintings, all over Terre Haute in our local art museum and on ISU's campus.
When did he paint the murals?
1979 is when they were completed, but they actually took 3 years of work between 77 and 79, 76 and 79.
So is he still alive?
He passed away, I want to say in 2008, but he still has descendants in Terre Haute, family members that I'm personal friends with, who are also great supporters of the Debs Foundation and Museum today.
Excellent. Can you briefly tell the audience what his wife was like?
Absolutely. Kate Debs is another kind of favorite topic of mine. Kate, I think some would say, has been maybe misrepresented in some of the scholarship on Eugene Debs. I think some folks leave the biographies that have been written so far with the impression that Kate was kind of an aloof, possessive, almost class enemy of a housewife who didn't support Gene's politics and work. There's even a biographical novel. It's fiction, but it's supposed to be based in reality, about Debs. The title of that biographical novel by Irving Stone is Adversary in the House, with Kate being the adversary here. So that's the maybe old interpretation of Kate, but there's newer research by some scholars that I want to give a shout out to, John and Mickey Moran. Mickey, or Michelle, is the secretary of the Debs Foundation, and they are both fantastic historians and researchers who are looking at Kate through her own lens, and I think giving us a more holistic picture of Kate's life. Kate was born in Pittsburgh and raised in Louisville in a family of working class German immigrants. She could, we don't know for sure, but could have been exposed to socialism through her German immigrant family long before she ever met her husband. When she was 4, her father died, and when she was 9, her mother remarried into a family that eventually opened the drugstore in Terre Haute. So Gene and Kate were both the children of successful merchants. Gene's parents ran a grocery store. There's, I think, a misconception that Kate married down and lost her status, but the net worths of their two families were pretty close the year of their marriage. Kate was a more reserved kind of a person than her husband. Gene Debs was kind of this over-the-top gregarious figure who could, speak for hours at a time with his oration as a spokesman for a movement. And Kate, I would say, did more behind-the-scenes work. She was a suffragist, a musician, a heck of a euchre player for any Midwesterners listening. And for those who are not, euchre's a pretty competitive card game. Tells me that Kate had a competitive streak here. But Kate really made it her role to keep the house as a sanctuary for Gene to return to after his long travels. And Gene Debs constantly traveling, campaigning, giving lecture tours, but when he was home, he had to recover his health. Kate then would not let in every stranger who showed up at the front step of their Terre Haute home if word got out that her famous husband was back in town. So she gets the nickname of the gatekeeper from the public. So kind of a negative idea, but from her perspective, she was looking out for her family, which we see a lot. She raised her nephew in the house, even though Gene and Kate never had their own children. She also cared for her mother for several years in the house, kind of cobbled together a family experience that it seems she really valued. She also documented a lot of her husband's work, as well as her family. She was an avid scrapbooker, so we have a lot of Kate's scrapbooks in the museum and in the Debs collection at ISU. And I think I like to imagine her as a reserved but very dignified person. She was also staunchly devoted to the cause, and as a suffragist, wrote in local papers about women's right to vote. One article we have from 1910, Kate was responding to a wealthy Terre Haute woman who had just written to argue against suffrage. That lady had said, that ladies don't need votes, they have husbands for that. And Kate responded by saying, if the pampered pets of society do not wish to vote, then the working women do. So she actually brought that class perspective to the suffrage conversation, I think in a meaningful way. So I think Kate's great. I don't think she's been given her due. So on the tours of the museum, I really like to spend some extra time focusing on Kate and her contributions to the cause.
Excellent. So earlier you mentioned how you have free tours and people can make suggested donations. So is that the best way for people to support the museum, is to visit and send you donations?
Absolutely. There's a lot of ways that you can support us, whether it's coming to see the house in person or on Zoom. You can support our work at debsfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation, and that's what keeps the lights on and the bills paid. So we're really appreciative of any support that anyone is able to send. We also have an online gift shop for the museum. So again, if you head to debsfoundation.org, you can find the link to our gift shop where you can buy posters, buttons, political pins. We normally have that iconic For President, convict number 9653 button, but they're currently out of stock. They'll be back in soon. That's the replica or reproduction of the 1920 campaign button when Debs ran for president from Atlanta prison. But in any case, we also have t-shirts, postcards, all kinds of swag that we can send out to anyone in the country or to Canada or anywhere else if you'd like to support our work by shopping on the gift shop. And also tell your friends. Word of mouth really helps us get the word out about Debs and the fact that his house is a home to visit. So if you know somebody who might be interested in this history or could maybe have a lot to learn from it, let them know who Debs was and why his story is worth telling today.
Terrific. Allison, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your work with our audience.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. It was really great to join today, and I hope to meet some visitors who come from this podcast soon.
Wonderful. We wish you and your museum all the best.
Thanks, and same to you in Free Press Media. All the best.
Take care.
Bye-bye.